Okay. For people who are joining this live stream, this is another of a series of meetings about a fairly complicated topic of database integration for Wolfram Language. So let's see, where do we start here?
We have a few things from the last meeting that we sort of halfway through.
Okay, well, so let's remember what we were trying to achieve here. We're trying to get some naming and functionality for a bunch of these functions, correct?
Yes, but that's probably not the most important.
Okay, well, so tell me what the most important thing is.
There are two. One is the runtime types, which I think we sort of agreed upon, if you remember, entity runtime types, which is, I'm not sure if it's in this notebook, but this is something we discussed before. And the idea was that as we build a query, we create generalized types which are defined by the queries themselves, rather than being registered and have string names. And so those types have to exist on equal footing as string types registered in the entity store.
Yeah, right. Okay, but let's zoom out for a moment here, okay?
Sure.
Do we have a guide page for this functionality yet?
No, because a few things have to still be figured out for that.
Okay, well, so let's walk through again from the beginning. Let's walk through it again, okay? So first of all, we're connecting to a database here, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And the fundamental thing we're trying to do is to map that database onto an entity store. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, so this idea that the entity store itself has, so database inspect, what does database inspect do?
It actually connects to the database, inspects its structure, and returns to us an object which we call SQL Database Object, which is basically a schema.
All right, let's look at that input there. Okay, so database inspect on its own gives you this SQL database object, right?
Yes, that's correct.
Which can have what kind of thing? So you can make, it has various properties and things like that. Is that correct?
Yes, so it has the entire information about database schema.
Right, so for example, it presumably has information about what entities. That's really weird. Why is it asking that? I just did it. Did it crash? Okay, so in any case,
next time try saying no to you want to evaluate all the, because there are other input cells that are not really initialization cells.
Okay, in any case, somewhere it must give a list of string entity types that it wants to introduce based on this database schema. Is that correct?
Well, it doesn't give that list directly because it's, you can use certain methods to extract it.
Right, but that's the point. But then when you say entity register here, it's registering all of those string named entity types,
yes,
right?
That's right.
Which is something that we may or may not decide is a good idea.
Yeah, but
right, because
for now,
spray. Well, hold on a second. So some random schema, it's going to spray those things into a single namespace, right?
Yeah, but in that case, it is your job to you can use the entity store to to alias those tables and name them differently. Say you want camel case names instead of underscores and stuff like that.
Well, but how do you even know what they are? So just given this database object,
you would do that in separate steps.
Okay, so tell me how, given the database object, how do I find out what the entity types that it introduces are?
Okay, do properties of that. Now do, instead of properties, tables. So those, by default, if you create an entity store without putting anything in the first argument, or rather just passing the SQL database object, it's going to use those.
Okay, but wait a minute. Those are table names. Those are not.
Yeah, we are mapping the tables to the entity types. That's the default behavior.
Okay, so let me look at one of those tables. So, for example, how do I look at the editor table from that SQL database?
So, %5 editor properties.
Okay, so how do I get that out as a data set?
So far, you don't.
Okay, but so that would be a good thing to be able
But basically, if you want to do it now, what you could do is like you take. Oh no, it has 2 arguments.
That would be database query. I can write some code.
Okay, but I mean that seems like a desirable thing to be able to do, to get a table of the database out as a data set. Yes.
Yeah, we can. Yeah. I guess we can do that as a data set.
Oh, you mean a table? Yeah, sure.
Right, and I mean arguably. Okay, so I'm just walking this through from the top. Okay, so what we've got here at the top, we have an SQL database. We are.
I mean, there is a thing I feel a bit uneasy about putting this into SQL Database Object, and it's the fact that in general, SQL Database Object properties don't need to query the database. Never pull out data.
Well, fine, then have a different way of doing it. Say data set of something or other. But we need, it's not obvious.
We have functions to do that. They're just not in the system.
Oh, wait a second. Stephen, did you mean by table, extracting table, did you mean table data? Or did you mean table metadata?
No, table data. I want to get that table out as a data set. Right?
Oh, the table data. Okay, I see.
Yeah, I want an easy way to go into this database.
I did that. I mean, you need to pass DB is the name of the object that you created before by using database inspect, and it's in the shell. I've sent it there, and that should basically work. So.
What's DB?
DB.
Right. DB should be %5.
Okay, so let's walk through. Okay, what did that mean?
Remove dataset probably is a problem. Sorry.
I'm sorry?
Remove dataset, and let me see. That's probably a failure, but oh yeah, you got an old.
Okay.
You got a bug. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Okay. But so let's take a look here. Database. So what does this return? So database table of, let's say, editor. What does that actually return?
No, nothing. That's just.
By the way, we got a bunch of background noise. It'd be great to not have that.
Actually, Stephen, this was a wrong expression. Apart from being,
okay, just tell me what to do. Yeah.
Right now you can't because there are issues that are leaked into
fine.
product.
Not a problem. Okay. So I want to again take this from the top. So
you can use instead of author, try editor. That should work in the current setup. No, sorry.
Ricardo, there is this issue with precision, which is like for all.
Yeah.
Things.
Okay. All right. Okay. Let's look through this again. Okay. So Tony, this entity store result here, which I find a little odd. What is this? What does this all mean at the top here?
So it's a list of types to metadata about those types. And this looks like a sensible default that you can edit later.
I see. So there is no metadata being provided here. Right. This is the metadata is only structural. That is.
Yeah, that's
already the property names could be considered metadata of the type.
Yeah, fair enough. So this is okay, fine. So and then this is the payload here. So in an entity store, normally there is no second argument payload, right? We would expect to have the actual data in that first argument, correct?
Actually, Stephen, I think we agreed that we should have second argument.
Yes, we did. We talked about that when we designed entity store.
Right.
I'm just trying to understand what the trade-off is. So in principle, we could move stuff over from the second argument to the first argument. And which wins? The first argument?
Or vice versa.
Oh, you mean if both are present?
Yeah, so in other words, if I give explicit values in the first argument, does it win or does the second argument win?
I think that for SQL backed stuff, we can't really support it.
Yeah. And the reason
so
is
you can only give hold on. So you can only give metadata in the first argument when there is a backing system. When the second argument is backed by an SQL database.
Exactly.
Okay.
And actually, Stephen, I think we think that it would be more consistent to have it for all backends like that.
That the actual data lives in the second argument.
As what? As a data set normally, or what?
Or no, even just as an association of associations.
It's a backend dependent thing, I think.
I mean, if you,
Tony, can you
I guess we
on
can
this,
support a database at that set.
Tony?
Yes.
Can you comment on that, please?
About where the data should be?
Yeah, I'm asking the question. Right now, in Entity Store, it's possible to have the entity property values in the first argument.
Right.
Okay, so what these guys are suggesting is that the second argument should be able to contain what exactly? What is its structure? What is the proposed structure?
So the second argument of Entity Store could, in principle, contain any data source, and one of them is a database, or...
No. Were you listening? No, we're talking about the case where it's directly there.
I understand. Yeah, so, or the right-hand side of the entities entry.
Yes, that's correct. Okay. And that's enough, is that right? Or does it have to have, no, because the Entity Store this is like a table, right? This outer T is like a table, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
So I don't see how this can have
but look, I think that when you have like data, they are already like, you know, structured in a particular way. And it would be great if you can just put it in an argument instead of, you know, constructing this association with
yes, I know. So
values and stuff.
Right.
So you need to build it by yourself.
Right. But I think that the right way to do it is not with the way you're doing it right now. I think the right way to do it is if there is something that comes in automatically from here, that this stuff, instead of being blank here, has some kind of inherited or automatic thing, which means pull it in from the second argument. You see what I'm saying?
No, but Stephen, the stuff in the first argument has nothing to do with data. It's all metadata.
It's not. Look at this case. It's data. Look at this case.
In this case, yes.
Okay, so let's
Stephen, our proposal would be to take basically the second argument in this case could be an association that contains as the keys the types, then as the values associations that each represent with entities as the keys and properties as the
right. Okay.
So three level.
Yes.
Okay. So notice that here there is no entities thing. Is that correct?
Never. Yeah.
Yes.
We cannot support that.
Right. Okay. So what we're saying is, what I'm suggesting is that what you do is in this first argument you say entities arrow automatic. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yes. But the question is rather whether we actually want to support entities in the first argument at all. And if what are the advantages?
Because it's convenient to have, look, in small cases, it's convenient to be able to put everything in there explicitly. I think it's a fine idea. Okay, listen, it seems like there are two different cases that are worth supporting. One is the first argument has everything, including entities. And Tony, you're with us here?
Yes.
And the second case is that the first argument is primarily metadata, and the main blob of data is in the second argument, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so now there are two ways we could do that. One is the first argument is silent on the question of what entities exist, and it picks them up from the second argument. And the second approach is that it explicitly says, oh yeah, for this table, the entities are automatic. But I don't think that's quite going to work because the second argument can refer to multiple tables, right?
Yeah, the second argument should refer to multiple tables, but that's
okay.
fine.
But so then the second argument structure needs to be something which is very much mirroring what's in the first argument.
Yeah, except you don't need the level where it says entities.
I understand that. I understand, which is a little confusing. And
well, there is an intermediate proposal, which is that we support the thing you have under your mouse now as a constructor for convenience for small cases. but then it always normalizes to 2 arguments so that we don't have to deal with cases where you mistakenly put both things.
Yeah, that will not break backward compatibility, even if this function is experimental right now. So, I mean, if we want to
okay, fine. Tony, can you comment on this?
Argument.
Yep, I get it. Tony, can you comment on this, please?
On what side again?
What we were just discussing. Right, using this as a, please pay attention. Right, using this as a constructor, right, in this form, but having it break the entities part, remove the entities part from the first argument, and put it in the second argument in a different, slightly different format without the entities level.
That's an option.
Is it a good idea?
I don't see a reason why not to do it.
Also, Stephen, there is a counter argument against entities staying in the first argument, and that is that data generically can come from elsewhere, and mixing them with metadata can actually create lots of issues for people. You know?
Fair enough. Okay. Look, okay, so provisionally we can think about doing this.
And another thing that is very easy to support right away is that we could support as a second argument something like a file wrapper that then points to a .m file. That would be a very poor man version of a persisted to disk database.
Well, I agree, but I don't even know whether that's okay. But okay,
not only also it can be
hold on. We're now inventing another format here, which is something that is exactly the same as this, except it's basically a collection of associations, right? It's a nested collection of associations: table name, entity name, property name. Correct?
Yes.
Okay, so it's very hard for me to understand why, I don't think it should work that way, okay? I think if we're going to do that, it should essentially declare that that's what it's doing by saying entities arrow automatic or some such other thing in the first argument.
Yeah, we can do that.
Thereby
you don't need to specify
what's going on. What's that?
I mean, if it's automatic, you don't need to write automatic, so.
No, you don't need to, but the canonical form would be to do that. So that
what for?
No. So that in the future, when this thing needs to support some kind of graph database or some other crazy thing, that we're not, oh my gosh, we just used up that syntax.
But no,
second argument to have this particular structure, which I don't think is a general enough structure.
Stephen, the problem is that, okay, regarding to database, if you are able to specify like, a backend for each table in the same entity store, that will remove the purpose of having an entity store in the first place. Because if you are using like 10 different databases to specify...
That's not what I'm suggesting.
Right, but I'm saying that syntax is suggesting this, because basically if you are able to specify a backend for each type...
I'm not suggesting that.
No,
I'm not suggesting that.
But that is similar, right?
No, I'm suggesting that either it says automatic, in which case it comes from the second argument, or it can be given explicitly, in which case it's right there.
Yeah, but still,
I think
if we decide that the version where you do it explicitly then evaluates to the other one, then there's no need to keep the entity key.
Okay, I don't think it's a good idea, because I think one wants a case where some of these things might be tiny little tables that are explicitly given here, and other ones might be big things which are in the second argument.
But what's the problem with it normalizing to that?
It's not a good idea, because you can't normalize it. What are you going to normalize it to? Because if you've got this thing, you can't
normalize it.
Wait. You can't combine the normalization of this little, table with this big SQL database object.
But you can't put, if you have the SQL database object, you can't do that anyway, even if it's a tiny table in the first argument. We can't support.
Well, at present we cannot, but hopefully we will be able to.
But then you need to define the semantics.
Not really. I mean, why? I mean, the problem is that you can have multiple entity store, right?
Listen.
If you have multiple backend, you just write multiple entity store. This is what the entity store is. I think.
I understand. I understand. Listen, we don't need to solve this problem. Let's move on. Okay.
Another thing that I want to put on record here is that the second argument doesn't need to be a nested list of associations, especially for graph-like data. It could be an adjacency list.
Okay, but what's going to declare what it is, Carlo? That's the point I keep on making.
Stephen, if I may make a comment on this, then I think given that the data sources will be diverse and different, the right thing to do would be to define an interface they satisfy rather than declare their structure declaratively.
Possibly, yes. Which means that they've got to be wrapped somehow, which means that you can't take this naked thing and put it in the second argument. So we can take that off the table for now.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, so in terms of a file-backed thing, which I think would be nice, what on earth would that file look like? I mean, back in the day, we were intending that Dataset have a file-backed possibility. And right now, we're not allowing, you know, a single table in this database could back a dataset, right? Am I making sense?
Yes, of course.
With some limitations.
That is correct. But it could absolutely back a dataset. And I think we should support that. Right?
Yes, but that is, I think, a separate discussion.
No, I understand, but I want to understand what the strategy for doing that is. That is what it would roughly look like. I mean, the original plan was the data set could be backed by a file, and it would automatically, and I believe we made a lot of progress on that. Does anybody know what happened to that?
Well, it was my project streaming, I think. Right, Stephen?
Yes, that's right.
Are you talking about streaming?
Well, I don't know whether I'm talking about streaming. I'm talking about being able to have a file here that is a .csv file and have that be something that can automatically be used.
Yeah, so that's somewhat separate, but yeah, we had a plan for that.
Okay, so let's just talk about that for a second. Okay.
Okay.
So where the thing would be left on disk and would, you know, come into memory as needed. So what was the thing that what you ended up building was something where it has already been pre-prepared as a .mx file.
Yes, right. So
okay, so you have first step is to convert the CSV file into an MX file, right?
It was not just one MX file, it was generic.
Whatever, I don't care.
Yes,
it's some place, some local object, right? So what you're saying is there is some function that converts the CSV file into a local object. And
correct.
The data set can then refer to the local object, correct?
Correct.
Okay. So what and the concept there, so what happened to that?
Well, that project was almost completed, but there were a few technical problems that I still had to resolve. And the biggest problem was that we can't possibly hope to support the entire richness of data set by using that framework because it was not only file backed per se, but it was also out of core. So we should separate two notions here, Stephen. One notion is supporting by different objects, like, for example, single file, which is sort of one thing. So like generalized data set to support like multiple, being backed by multiple things. And the other thing is to support lazy out of core operations.
Yeah.
So
no, wait. Lazy is a different issue. I mean, okay, because you've got a whole big theory of laziness for the whole database system, right? So as we think about, you know, data set is not a lazy, you know, is a thing which does its operations immediately.
It doesn't have to, because all its query language is not actually necessarily eager. And in fact, what I developed with streaming was an illustration that you don't have to be eager. You can.
Okay, but the bottom line is, we could have something where you take a CSV file, you have an operation that converts it into your format, right?
Yes.
Or we could take, if I'm not mistaken, but maybe it's pointless, a database table and convert it to your format.
It's not pointless, and I hope that at some point we will connect these things together. But
why is it not pointless? Why shouldn't you just use that stuff in the database?
Why should I not use which stuff in the database?
The data that you're describing here in the database, rather than in
why would we convert the database data to my format?
Yes.
Because database data is sometimes huge and may not fit in memory.
but we don't. But none of this stuff is making it fit in memory. I mean, the database query system is specifically making the queries happen on the database server, not in memory.
Right, but you need to extract them for the user and bring them to Wolfram Language, to Mathematica.
Well, under certain circumstances, but well, okay. So hold on. So I'm trying to understand how this relates, because clearly one thing we absolutely need to be able to do, it's a very minimal thing, much less fancy than a lot of what we're trying to do here, is you've got data, it's in a database, I want to do data set operations on it.
So this one is comparatively easier, Stephen, because we have developed the entire layer to which database query language can be compiled, provided that you only deal with rectangular data sets.
Okay.
And so
but wait a second. If the data set is coming from an external SQL database, then by definition, it's rectangular.
Correct.
Okay. So the case that we're talking about is data set of an SQL database object or some such other thing, or more specifically, that a specific table in that, which you seem to be able to reference in this way, right? So
let me refresh your memory on that a little bit. About a year and a half ago, I was giving a demo where I was showing that you can compile dataset query language with a few extensions to basically work on databases. And so now we have the infrastructure that will make it possible to compile that query language to our internal layer. So that's very, very possible.
Okay.
So again, at that point, you made a point that we want to support entities as our final front end, so to speak, first, and that's what we've been doing.
Okay, fine.
But we made an infrastructure that would allow dataset to be supported too.
So just so I understand, I mean, hold on. So a data set, a typical random data set, doesn't necessarily have rows that are labeled by entities. You know, a typical random data set could just be, you know, for example, something like this. I mean, I could just say data set of, you know, random integer, you know, 10, you know, something like this, right? Now, actually, let me just do the single table version of that, the 2D table version of that. Okay, so is there a sense in which that can be meaningfully represented as a database?
Probably not, because you need names for the columns.
Okay, so in other words, in the SQL world, there is no meaningful way in which one can have an unnamed column set up.
There is one, but it's not supported in all backends. There are data types called arrays, where you can just have an array which can be multidimensional.
Okay, but this is not the typical case. I'm sorry?
I mean, you still need a name for the whole array.
No, I understand that. But so an individual table, so the point is that you're saying there have to be entities. Those entities will normally be local entities of a database. They will not be global entities known to our system. Is that right, Tony and others? Tony?
That sounds right, to have some kind of non-registered entities on which you can work.
Right.
This is the whole idea of having an entity store and not
which defines its own entities.
Yes, and still working with it without registering it.
Okay, fine. So these will be the things you get from databases will be fairly special data sets.
Yes.
You should still be able to extract the data set, but it will be a fairly special data set.
Yes.
As opposed to the things that, and again, we need to understand this roadmap. I mean, the basic roadmap would be that the things that will be being picked up into your streaming format, Leonid, will be things that are basically coming from external files. Right? So like a CSV file. Well, what's the beyond that example?
There can be all kinds of files that allow streaming import, not necessarily CSV.
No. I understand that, but I'm saying the source would be, it could be an HDF file, it could be, you know, a bunch of other file formats, right? But fundamentally, And it can also be a database. Well, I don't understand that. That
Well,
case,
imagine, I mean, I can give you an example.
No, I don't think it's a database. It's a query, right? I mean, once you have done a query,
Yes, a query.
Slice it. You can filter again, and so
Yes.
basically you just need to support basically all the, especially like for the formatting. When you click a column, if we have a query with 10 columns, we can of course run the query only with that column that you clicked. And when you scroll, when you go to the next page, that is just an offset. So when you have a query and you just need to do something like database of query, and that will basically do things only in the front end or only when you start mapping stuff.
Yes. So maybe let me explain the distinction. The distinction is this: you can create like pageable object that essentially will always call a database for the next page. Alternatively, you can offload the entire data set into the streaming format, and then all the other operations you perform on it, which are supported by streaming object, will be supported from within the Wolfram kernel.
Right. And I think that would be nice, because basically it sometimes happens that you have done a query and the query is small enough now to continue in memory. And so you do a query for 100 elements and then you use dataset to continue in memory and do
but Riccardo, what is the opposite situation. It's like,
yes.
So there is also a middle ground where the data set is too big to fit in memory. It's not too big to fit on disk, and you want to perform operations that cannot be run on the database, but cannot be run without chunking.
Exactly.
Right.
But for then you just do a query that is smaller, or you take a slice.
No,
but you don't need to. That's the whole point. I mean,
yes.
Look, the point is that at any stage in this process, once you've got a result from a database query, you can basically wrap it in Dataset, and you will have something which will automatically figure out, does it move the whole thing into memory? Does it stream the thing, etc. Right?
Exactly.
Right.
So
I'm just suggesting to continue in memory, because then you don't need to, recompile.
Right. So simple case, you can do it in memory. Right.
It depends. Yeah.
Okay. So let's continue here. Okay. So I think I get this. So I'm sorry?
No, I was saying maybe we are getting a bit sidetracked with respect to the main theme, which
No, we're not. We're not. We're working up to the main theme. We're trying to make sure we have a good foundation here, right? So,
maybe, Stephen, would you want then to maybe make some sections, or would you just remember? Because I mean, one of the problems is that in all these meetings,
well, apparently we don't have any notes, which is really kind of upsetting.
Yeah.
Do we have notes? I mean, is Dominic? Are you making notes from this?
I am making notes from this, and I've got some older meetings archived as well.
Because I think we at least need to structure our, discussion so that something is left, and we remember that we were discussing.
Right, so you want me to basically make the notes from this? So then, okay. So let's look at this in. So first issue is we're saying so. I don't know why is it called Database Inspect? Why is that not just Database Connect?
Because it does different thing than just connecting, it doesn't only connect, it also inspects.
There is also a database connect. A database inspect returns a schema. If you just want to connect without figuring out what's in there. Okay, so database connect does it return a database object as well, an SQL database object as well?
We are managing the connection internally. We have this function if we want to expose it, but basically the way it works is that we are opening the connection at the very last moment. So by default, I think you don't need to connect by hand. You just run a query and we take care of opening a connection if there is no one. Then there is a system to query the connection that are opened, and you can close them. That's probably important. I think disconnect is more important than connect. But we have the system in place. So we have a database connection object that contains database information, and you can
Which is different from an SQL database object.
Right.
Yes.
Just do database connection, I think, of the %5, I guess. So database connection. Right. Okay, so this is the object that is inside SQL Database Object. And you can see what's inside with the input form. It's really straightforward, but yeah, or you can do that. It's basically two keys, backend, in this case SQLite, but otherwise it's backend like MySQL and then host, password, domain, and this kind of stuff. And yeah, it's an association. There is also format.
This is where the connection is a subpart of the SQL database object. Is that correct?
Right. Yes, but it doesn't have to be. It can be also used sort of independently.
I mean, especially in this case, since the database is actually a file on your local disk.
Okay. That's a specific.
In general, the idea that we were having was this: basically, each time you have a function that can do basically an operation on the database, like database query or inspect or something, you can pass a schema. The schema can contain the connection, but you can also pass to the other function, to the outside function. Connection goes to, and you pass another connection. That takes the priority. And so
you mean with the same schema?
Right.
Okay.
Right. You can have a master-slave configuration, or you can create a master-slave configuration like that.
I think this is a bit muddled here, okay? I think there are too many functions here. I don't understand. Okay, so, and why this is called SQL Database Object and this is simply called Database Connection, I have no idea.
That's because, Stephen, because Database Connection is supposed to be an internal object that we right now don't expose. And SQL Database Object is supposed to be something that we are going to document.
But also database connection can be used in Sparkle or stuff. So, which is why it's just
database connection is really just how it.
All right. Okay. So this is a general connector.
Yeah. On the other hand,
it's a specification. Yes.
SQL Database Object has a lot of machinery like tables, etc., that don't exist in other types of databases.
Which is why we're trying to differentiate that with the SQL prefix.
Okay, fine.
Also, as far as I know, like if you have an RDF endpoint, you can just say, tell me what the shape of the data is. There's no equivalent really of database inspection for RDF.
Is that correct, Tony?
Yes, in some sense, instead of asking for a schema, which is a different operation, you would just write some queries, check what are the properties, and so on.
Okay.
And some RDF endpoints have also ontologies that you can query.
Yes.
It's kind of wrong that I'm writing these notes. I mean, it's kind of like, why are we writing any other notes then?
Well, but in a way, you are driving the discussion.
Fine. Okay, so we can take database query and turn it into a data set. Right? Now, the other thing is out of core operations, we talked about. And there, what we talked about is convert from an external file, e.g. CSV, HDF, etc., to a streaming blob. What did you call those?
Well, the last thing was streaming dataset, but
okay. Well, anyway, so fine. So it's streaming blob, which can then be accessed through dataset by queries, right?
Yes, except yeah, that's correct.
Okay.
There are a few gotchas there, but I'm not going to discuss them.
Okay, fine. Okay, so then a streaming blob, as we're calling it for right now, might also be produced from a database query.
Correct. And even then, it can be produced in two distinct ways.
Okay, we don't need to know about that right now.
Yes. Well,
okay.
Probably yes.
Okay, all right. So entity store design. Okay. What we discussed is should the value payload always go in the second argument?
And our opinion, meaning database group, is yes.
right? Well, I think my argument would be we should allow it in either argument. In the first arg, we should have, e.g., entities goes to automatic optionally to indicate that it's in the second arg, that it can be found in the second arg, or that can be omitted.
I think we might want later to have a separate dedicated discussion on this.
Okay, well, I think we should implement it as like this, and we'll go from there. Okay, so let's keep going. Okay, so the next issue is that you really want to talk about. What is all this stuff?
So runtime. Okay, so basic types. Yes, I think this is about runtime types and the related notion of all these operations below. Entity select.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So these are things. Let's see.
So do you want me to remind you in like a few general words, what was this about? Or do you remember?
I more or less remember, but I want to know what the overall roadmap of what we're trying to do is. So we had talked before about some of these horrendous things like entity join across and so on, right?
Yes, but from our current viewpoint of this meeting, I think these are more like specific details.
Okay.
So the generic thing that we were discussing was that in the entity store, in an entity framework, originally only string entity types were allowed in things like, entity property, for example.
Okay.
And then what we realized is that these new extensions, these new query primitives, such as entity select or entity sort by, etc., they introduced new types which are defined by the query itself, not by a string or anything like that.
Well, okay, so did you review this with Tony separately? Tony wasn't in the last meeting, which was kind of a goof.
So we did. I think that there is still a couple of things where Tony is not 100% on the same table as us, and maybe you should speak about
table, page, whatever. You've been doing databases too long. Go ahead. Okay, but let's review then what you had said. What's an example of a compositely named construct here?
Oh, but you mean a runtime type, or there are two separate issues. The one you're looking at is a kind of runtime type. Is that what you mean? Because there is another
runtime. Okay, naming of generated entity types is what you're saying.
Yes. And so there, our argument was that you have to simply use the query, like inert query itself, that defines for you the type, this runtime type as a representation of that. And so in particular, in the first argument of entity property, you should allow such things.
Okay, but so let's remember what entity does right now. So if I say entity, and you keep on telling me it's really entity class, but I'm, so if I do something like this, okay. Okay, I get that rather useless thing out, and I have to do entity list if I actually want to resolve that.
No, you want to do entity value.
Where do I want to do entity value?
You never want to do entity list on that. You actually, what do you care about? You care about the names and the populations. So you would do entity value of that.
I don't agree with you. I don't agree. I'm sorry. I think that's a fake.
No, it's not a fake. What you are doing is a fake. That's the truth. Like, we were talking about it last time. If you do entity list and then you do entity value as a separate operation, then I mean, countries don't change that often, but the data might have changed.
Okay, whatever. Okay, so are you saying if I say that of name, oh, it does work. Okay, so if I say that of name population, okay, so this is Tonyism and it's working fine.
Yeah, I think that Tony is also coming around to liking doing things in one clue 20 value.
Well, yeah, that has always been the preferred way, because why first resolve a potentially large class to entities and then send the entities back to the server to retrieve the data?
Yeah, well, fair enough. Do we tell users this and document it?
We are trying to document the preferred way.
Okay. All right. Okay. But let's go back now to the case of the database case, right?
Yeah, and that actually is not just database case, because these new primitives, query primitives, are going to be universally supported by the entity framework.
Okay, well, fine. So let's give an example then. Give an example of where this, okay, give an example of the analog of this in a more sophisticated case.
If you use something like inside entity class, if you use something like, well, actually entity select of entity class country.
Entity select.
Of entity class country. Country.
Okay.
And then the second argument of entity select is going to be entity function.
What happened to the entity class here? What am I saying here?
I think you should say comma all. Correct?
Tony?
Yes.
And what should I do there?
And here.
Is that correct, Tony?
Yes.
Okay, fine. Go ahead.
And then you write entity function. And then open bracket variable, no, not a string, like say country lowercase variable, comma, and then country open bracket string population. For example, smaller or larger than some number.
Okay, and so now I run that.
And it doesn't run because this is an inert query, and to run it, you need to wrap entity value around it and request certain property. And what is this you requested?
That's expected because currently you can't compare units with pure numbers.
You're going to fix that, right?
Yeah.
There is a bug report, but not all people agree, because what can happen is if you say 1 person equals 1 and 1 equals 1 apple, then you say person equal apple. So because equal is transitive. So people are hesitant to make this change.
Well, so we need some way to deal with this. So we'll need a separate discussion. Why is this unbelievably slow? What's it doing?
It might not yet support quantity inside entity function. But this is like, maybe we could pick some properties.
Well, you can try something that runs locally against.
Okay, but so the thing I did before with the take largest, how would we do that?
There will be 2 operations to do that. You need to first take like sort, entity sort by, and then after that, do.
That doesn't seem right, because you should be able to do a take largest directly. I mean, without having to have some weird function called entity take largest. Right?
Yeah,
because,
but yeah, Stephen. But the thing is that take largest from the point of view of tables or like sets, like, you know, it's not a primitive operation. It's a composite operation.
I understand, but that's not for us. It's not. Okay, so what this is saying, so here, what are we doing here? We would say entity class, and then we would give a pure function greater than, and now we say 10 to the 8 people. Is that correct?
Yes.
That was our formal way of doing it.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay.
But the reason I gave the example with entity select is that even though
I don't like, by the way, I don't like, how do we get out entities here? I mean, I guess we say entity list, but that's a very, I don't like getting just these names out. Anyway, never mind.
Instead of name, you can write entity.
But on the other hand, in terms of practical work that people do, they are more often interested in specific properties than just a list of entities.
Yeah. For some things. Okay, right. Okay, fine. But so what we've got here is this is the alternative way using entity select is on the entity class is the alternative way of dealing with this shorthand notation where this is effectively an implicit entity select.
Yes.
Except it has the additional property that we can say take largest whatever, which we are not supporting here for some reason, because what this really is some kind of entity function type. I don't know how to think about this, right? This is something.
You're correct. That's right. But it's
so this is a different construct than you have right now for entity select.
So in the entity class, the issue is that the right-hand side in general are predicates, but there are some exceptions that are not predicates, like take largest or nearest to, and they are handled specially because they are not predicates. But
all right, okay. But so how would those be handled in the full form?
These things here, like greater than, the rule syntax will be converted to entity select.
Okay, fine, but I'm asking about things like nearest to or take large or take largest.
Okay, so here the strategy I think is the following: you represent that by two operations like entity sort by and entity something like entity take of a given number, and then we'll have optimizations that will take into account that, for example, you don't have to sort the entire thing to just extract a few things.
Okay, I understand that, but we have a nice syntax here with entity class, and it would be nice if there was a full version of that syntax that supported the same kinds of things, rather than if you're not using that syntax, you have to go in this multi-step thing.
But the problem, Stephen, is that the new syntax that is based on these new operations like entity select, sort by, etc., is strictly more powerful in general.
I understand that. I understand that. So I'm saying that it should degenerate. There should be a path where it degenerates to this that doesn't require multi-step. It's probably an additional operation in the entity select world.
Yeah, I guess we could introduce an additional operation such as entity greater than.
No,
entity
no.
take largest.
No, I don't think you need that. I don't think you need that. You need some kind of general, entity. I don't know. I'm making this up. Okay, entity apply to an entity class of something like take largest, blah blah blah. That's the wrong way to do it. It would be.
But this is more or less what I also suggested, because entity apply is effectively just saying that you are building up a query, right?
Yeah, I understand that, but I'm talking about what the user thinks, right? The user thinks this is as if I'm applying this operation to this class. See what I'm saying?
Yes, except if we have if you apply something to a class as a whole, it would make sense to apply it externally to a class rather than having it as a second argument, I think.
Well, okay, no, look. The issue is, this. If you have an entity class, right? So let's say I have an entity class. I don't even know how we refer to all countries. Okay, so let's say entity class country all. That I guess is our way of referring to all countries. Okay. Now I could say take let's see. what I've got is a property. So what I'm saying is, this is a take largest by. This is the curried form. Oh boy, that's something kind of complicated. But you get what I'm saying, that we want something which is the full version of this kind of syntax, right? That doesn't involve multiple steps. Let's come back to that.
Let's come back for a second to this. Like, how would you even, like, there's no way you can do that directly with select, right? So
no, I don't think you can do it directly with select. So you need a different function to do this.
I mean, and there's like a very simple example that's already beyond what just having a list of rules can do, which is like if you have an OR, just condition.
Sure. Right, so, I understand. That's why I'm asking for a function that does this in a fuller form so that you can actually manipulate the pieces. Right? Yeah, what is the operation? So for the general app here,
I think there's a mistake in your reasoning in that you're thinking that you can say just apply a bunch of take largest, select, and so on. But the thing is that we have like 5,000 functions and we will support 10 there, no more. So what's the point?
Well, we've already got that issue with entity class, right? There are only certain predicates that will work here.
Yeah, and that's why I think it's better to have like this.
Okay, I don't think so. I think we want a function. Hold on, we can loop back to this, but we're going to want a function. Can we put this on the list and not forget it? We'll need a function that does the equivalent of entity class blah 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 of blah 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 arrow blah blah blah. Okay, let's come back to that though. All right, what I want to do is go on here.
Yeah, I think that the main question that I want to discuss with Tony is, do we want single entities of these runtime types? And if so, what is their first argument?
Yes, and wait, what we already suggested, and actually, Stephen, we already went with that, with you on that, was that the first argument in that case should be the entire inert query that represents this runtime type.
Okay, but I just want to see an explicit example here. Do we have that, please?
Yeah, but we kind of started it with you just a few minutes ago with that entity select.
Well, on the notebook on the left, you have, I don't know, 20 examples of that.
Okay, so let me see an example. So is this an example?
So no, you have to look at the entity, what entity list returns. So for example, if you scroll down, entity aggregate by, I mean, the examples with entity annotate, entity class don't really change much. But if you look at entity aggregate by, there's an example.
I'm not understanding this. So let's take a look at this one here. So this here is some class of some entity class, right? And if I wanted to, I could say entity list of that. What the heck?
Yeah, I'm not sure that.
What the heck is that? The heck is that?
You have a very.
This is because we had that bug that's made it into the build.
Okay, fine. So what would this? So normally, what this would do is produce something which are yellow boxes like this. Is that correct?
Yes. The question is, what is the input form of those yellow boxes?
Okay. And what is the output form also? So those yellow boxes, if the thing has a name, if the entity has a name, is that right? Or what are those numbers there?
Well, that's the primary key of the database table. So that's the canonical name of the entity.
Okay.
The canonical, not the.
But so right now, this is represented as that's the raw table content in the database.
Yeah, we already no. So the thing is that if you in the entity store, you can set a label property that can do a string join of first name and last name of.
Well, whatever it is, but that's the thing that appears in the yellow box. The label is what appears in the yellow box.
Yeah.
Right?
In this case, nobody set the label, so we're
right. I understand. So you're using the primary key, and that's all good. Now the question is, what happens if the thing that you are looking at, where you do entity list, isn't something that
exists natively?
is coming directly from a database table with primary keys and so on, right?
Not only that, Stephen. When it comes directly from a query that involves already several transformations.
No, I understand. I understand.
So
can you give me an example of what does this do? Do you want to share the screen and just show me what this does right now?
I mean, in that case, it's not very interesting because
what does it do?
But yeah,
what does it do?
It would be basically entity of that whole entity select title blah blah blah, comma.
Can you show me? Can you show me either send me a screenshot?
But still, you have that example in your notebook on the left. If you go and this entity group by, aggregate by here, you see that's the example. Entity list here, yeah. And you see it returns a list of entities, and each entity contains a large expression as a first argument.
Okay, I get it. Okay, so let's look at what that is. So that is, in the first argument there, it is the unresolved. I mean, normally it would be both. Wait. Normally there would be two things here. There would be the entity type and the specific name of the entity, right?
Exactly.
So what is this?
So this is the name of the entity, but this is something that we wanted to discuss with you as a next topic.
Okay.
No, we resolved that.
Well, what is that? What's that supposed to be?
So if it's a basic table and it has only one primary key, it's going to be just that. Otherwise, it's entity list and it wraps an association that goes property goes to value.
Well, wait a second. What are you saying? So this thing, okay. You are basically making a synthesized entity store, right? An on-the-fly synthesized entity store. Right?
Entity type, I would say.
No. Think of it this way, okay?
No, it's just a type.
No. Just a second, okay? Imagine you take an entity store. Tony, are you with us?
Yes.
Okay. Imagine you take an entity store and you make a transformation to the entity store. Right now, the only thing we can do at runtime, see, let's say, for example, we wanted to create a new virtual property in an entity store.
But it's going to be attached to some type, Stephen, I guess.
Okay, that's fine. Dandy. That's lovely. Terrific. Okay. Let's say it combines two types in the entity store. Okay. Let's say it's the, I don't know, something that.
Like a join?
For example, yes. Okay. And we are essentially synthesizing something which is like a runtime created piece of the entity store. Am I making sense?
Yes, but our claim is that it's again a new type rather than a new entity store.
Well, that may be, but I'm asking you, independent of databases, independent of external databases, I'm simply asking you, for an in-memory entity store, is there not a way to create effectively a synthesized type, synthesized extra pieces of the data entity store?
Yeah, but that's exactly the point, that we have to support it.
Well, I understand that. But I'm asking the question, independent of all of these operations like entity aggregate by and so on, which are lazy operations, I'm asking Tony, in the case of the entity store, what is something which you can do sort of immediately in memory? How does that work?
So
do you understand the question?
Maybe not, but first of all, I think that entity store is a container that happens to contain one or more types. And then you can work on each of these types independently, and there's nothing more you can do.
Okay, well, let's say we synthesize a property.
In the sense of adding a computed property to a type.
That's correct.
Yeah, so this is an operation abstractly defined. It has nothing to do with entity store. I think the entity store is just a container for types.
Okay, but let's imagine that you had pre-computed because what's happening here is that you're effectively, yes, you can synthesize new entity types, but you can also synthesize new entity properties, right? You can create an entity property here, a virtual entity property.
Yes, but because that property is going to be belonging to some type, you effectively are synthesizing a new type by doing
okay, I don't care. I don't care. The point is, in the entity store world, right? You could imagine taking an entity store and for that entity store, synthesizing a new property for all entities of a given type. Yes?
Yes, and our claim is that by doing this, you are defining new type.
Whatever. You can say that if you want to. But
No, but
either
that's
way,
important.
no, but
It's
either
important.
way, that's database thinking. I don't think that's
No.
particularly, it is, because you have to define a new table in database world.
It's more than a database thinking, Stephen, because we have a notion of entity type in the entity store. Do you remember we went through this, we had the hierarchy, you actually suggested that you have a hierarchy which starts with entity store, then goes to type, then goes to...
Yeah, I know that. I know that.
Okay.
I'm asking you, but in the case where you are referring to, so in some cases, okay, some properties just have explicit names because they had to be named because they were set up that way when the entity store was set up, okay? But imagine that you have a property that is synthesized. It's the square of some other property, let's say, okay?
Yeah.
It doesn't have a name. All you know about it is it's the square of the radius or something.
It can't not have a name. But...
Okay, so walk me through that, because that's what you're talking about here, is things that haven't been given names, that are only defined by their operation that produces them.
Yeah,
okay,
but we're talking about types.
That can only happen at the type level.
Why can that not happen at the property level?
It can. So the way we do that is if you do entity value, type that.
Yeah.
Entity value of title as a string, comma, entity function, x, comma, x, price, over square bracket price is a string, yeah, times 2. Yeah, I mean, apart from the fact that that doesn't work. So that's a temporary property that has not been given a name.
I see what you're saying. Okay, so that's an example. So entity function, okay, so in other words, the conclusion here is entity function lets you create a quotes virtual property.
Yeah, just like pure functions let you do that in normal case
Good point.
And if you want to name that and use it later, that's what we should be calling entity extend. That was entity annotate in the version before.
Okay, so let's you create virtual properties. What can we call it? Analogous to function. Okay, so now you're saying entity extend lets one name those virtual properties. Is that correct?
And not only that, but it then attaches that named property to certain type.
Okay, so fine. So that's exactly what I was talking about here. So walk me through, Tony. Will entity function work on a built-in type?
Yes, the idea is to have all of these entity functions be supported by all backends.
Okay, so fine. So let's say that I say entity value of country, comma, let's say population times 100. Well, actually, let me do something different here. Let me do something more interesting. Okay, let me say X of GDP / population. Right?
You can try it. It might even work.
I love your confidence.
Yes, but it is slow. Currently, it's not optimized because it's still prototype.
Okay, but that's okay. Fine. But that's super interesting then to understand that. Okay, so that's the way that you create a virtual property, so to speak. Right?
Mm-hmm. And that's basically, for at least for us, that's a shorthand of the entity value.
Here, let's do a smaller version of this. Let's say entity class. What can I do? Let's say something like countries in South America, countries in North America. That should be very easy, right? How come there's so many countries in North America?
Caribbean.
Okay, who knows? Who cares? But that's magnificent. That's great. I love it. Okay. So were I to want to say entity extend here?
Yeah, you would do something like, I guess that in the branch you have, it's still called entity annotate, but so you do entity value of entity. Well, or you know what, just do entity.
I don't think there's an entity value there. I think it's an entity extend, which returns, what does it return?
No, entity extend doesn't return. Also, if you want it to work, it's called entity annotate there.
No, I understand, but I want to write it out correctly and then I'll copy it down to
Okay.
with the
entity extend of that class of countries.
Yeah, okay.
Oh, but that's not an entity class. Right, just write entity. No, because that was a list of entities. Just write.
Yeah, but it should work the same. I mean, you just extend the whole,
it should work.
Every single one. Yeah.
Okay, then what will it say? What would I say?
Comma. And then write, I don't know, GDPPP, whatever you want to call it.
Okay. Okay.
And then arrow that entity function. Okay. And then what is this going to return? And nothing. And then you have to do a tonism.
A what?
Like you have to apply, that works like an entity class. So
what was it called? Entity annotate?
Annotate, yeah.
Okay.
And now you wanna, after that after that, you wanna do sub values and ask for GDPPP.
My gosh. Coolosaurus. Okay. Okay, I understand. Okay, so then this entity extend, I wonder if that's really the right name. I'm wondering whether it should be more like entity extension. And by the way,
yeah, you made that point already.
Didn't we want to do that for all of these? Entity selection, entity, et cetera, right?
Yes, but still, there are some arguments against this naming. And one of them is that all these operations are sort of lazy and, in a sense, more like carried form. And so since select also has a carried form and is lazy in that sense, it's closer to that than to...
Well, is this the carried form or is it not the carried form? It doesn't look very carried to me.
Well, it's carried in the sense that you have to, I mean, that thing you just did with the sub
It's not carried. I see.
In that sense, it's carried. I mean, the thing that
the entity select is not, walk me through the entity select here. The entities, this doesn't look at all carried to me.
No, then if you want something out, you have to say, give me the title of the books.
But what's the non-curried form of entity select?
There is none. No,
okay,
there is
maybe there should be one. I mean, because I don't think you can have it. Listen, if there is no non-curried form,
but then that you should have it for each guy and also entity class, right? And so, because the entity class, if you got it with sub value, you get out the property, and so adding this semantic everywhere. I mean,
no, but I'm saying entity class is a noun. Entity select is a verb.
You're right. But what I don't like about I think that in general, you're right in principle about having nouns. The thing is that trying to come up with those nouns led to very weird things.
Okay, but that's
like
worry
what's the
about...
noun of join across?
Okay, okay,
and
we're going to figure that out.
It makes the see alsoing with the rest of the language much easier.
No.
You say anti-select is like select. But
no, it's not like select. It's like selection. Because unless we can give it a non-curried form, unless we can give it something where, you know, for example, and I'm not suggesting this particularly, a 3-argument form in which it does immediately evaluate. In other words, if we can argue, if we can document something where there is an immediate form, where it's not purely curried, then I would go for that. Otherwise, I think we have to name them with nouns.
Well, do you think we might need a separate design meeting for naming? That would make sense, I think, because it's kind of a separate topic which has lots of arguments, you know.
So, sorry, say that again. What?
I'm saying that this topic of naming, I think it would deserve.
Yeah, I understand, but I strongly think. Okay, so let me make a note here. You know, should it be entity select or entity selection? So if entity select, it will need a non-curried form. Okay, but the thing that you wanted to raise here is the entity type specification, and we're running out of time here. But I now understand, after a lot of flapping around here, I now understand this notion of a virtual, of a pop-up property, basically. So what you are describing is, how do we make a pop-up type?
Yes.
Okay.
And the way is to simply take an inert query and declare that that is a pop-up type.
Okay, so this... Okay, so, right, so fine. So you're saying a query, I don't see any problem with that. I mean, that...
Yeah, we've been through that already and you agreed. So I think we are more like kind of repeating and finalizing that rather than...
Okay, but now in that case, that is the pop-up type. Okay, so let's take this as an example, right?
Yep.
So, that's an example of something with a pop-up type. However, when you have a pop-up type like that, there is a question of what you name the individual entities within the pop-up type. Is that correct?
Yes, and that's kind of a last or separate question, which we also discussed before.
So there are two issues with this. One is, what is the yellow box form of the pop-up type? That's one question. And the other is, what's the naming of the individual entity in the pop-up type? Right? Those are two. Yeah. What is the print form? And what is the entity name? Right? So normally, what we would do in one of these things is we would say, well, in the output, we don't say the type name normally, right? So in an input, if we say UK, for example, we'll see the type name there as country, right?
Yeah.
So in this case, you know, if we were to see a type name, it would be some kind of computed type name. But the more interesting question is, what is the entity name?
Yeah, and that's also the one that we've discussed at length in the previous meetings.
So what did we conclude?
I think we concluded that the form is this, that is represented here, that you have an...
No, but that's not a print form.
Oh, the print form.
Yeah, what is the print form?
You mean for the name?
Yeah, and what is this? This is some weird thing in a special context. So that's not really a real thing.
Except that this entity ID is going to either make it to a non-special context or replaced by some other identifier.
Okay, so this is the thing where we were considering mapping this into the external identifier business, yes?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So that external identifier, I see. So we were considering just entity ID of that thing or entity identifier of that thing. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, so then fine. I mean, what's wrong with that? So then it could be either some kind of weird key thing inside the database or something, or something different. But then there's the question of what is the print form of this? And I think we either need to be able to label that in the entity store, or we need to basically give some heuristic for deciding what it is, given the data that's here.
Yeah.
Am I making sense?
Yeah. I think the easiest way is to allow the user to instruct how this should be.
No, I agree. If you're labeling it, but I think we've got to have a heuristic if the user didn't say anything.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, listen, we ran out of time. Yeah, go ahead.
I wanted to open a big can of worms, but if we ran out of time, maybe it's not a good idea.
Well, okay, you can say it, but then we're not going to do it in this meeting.
Okay, so a question is, so there are some cases where changing the runtime type clearly affects whatever the primary keys are and so on. So it's obvious that the runtime type has changed. But if you take something and you resort it, then one could argue that you don't need that the type hasn't changed. But I think it should, because those things can be deeply nested. And if you decide not to change it for the trivial cases, then you need
I think it's a mistake. I think that's an optimization. I mean, if you choose to make that optimization, well and good. But the fact is, who cares whether the type is changed?
Yeah, but then the question becomes, like, if you do entity class of country G8, the entities that come out are of type country or are of type entity class country G8?
I would say the second.
No, but that's not correct. It's not correct. They resolve down, they evaluate down to the base entity type.
They can't always do that.
I understand
Sometimes
they can't always do it. So if they, okay, it's just like, sometimes an expression with nested square roots can evaluate down to the number 3, and sometimes it cannot.
Yeah, but then once you have like 5 nested levels of this stuff, then I mean you can peel some of the other ones, but not all of them.
Yeah, right. So it's a question of, is there a canonical form? Are there functions for getting canonical forms? Is there an equivalence tester? All the usual stuff. We've run out of time. Let's continue this, preferably, by the beginning of next week, so we haven't lost context here.
One problem with next week, Stephen, is that we all are going to the conference on Django.
Yeah, but on Tuesday we're going. So
okay, so you guys figure out what you want to do. Okay, but next time, can we make sure we have a proper agenda, and can we make sure that we've actually cleaned what we had here, and maybe tried to start generating guide pages and things?
Yes.
And
I think, Stephen, if I may make a suggestion, I would start next time with clearly stating which things we firmly agree on, which are kind of sealed, and which
I think it's what we were trying to do this time, and I think we've gotten a long way with that.
Yes,
I think we're the next things we have to do here. I think we need to look at these operations. I think we're actually in pretty good shape here. We just need to make see the stuff actually be implemented as we've specified, and I really think we're in quite good shape.
Yeah.
Okay, but things like this entity aggregate and so on, and entity join across, there's going to be some, we need to work through those a bit.
Okay.
All right. Okay. Thank you all. Thank you to people on the live stream who've been remarkably silent. This is probably a head-spinning topic, but to be continued. Talk to you later.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.